So today I'm going to break down chapter 2 of They Were Her Property. If you're watching on Instagram or YouTube, then you know you get 15 minutes. On TikTok, you get 3 minutes at a time. Just bear with me. This book is just... Chapter 2 opens with this thing called the doctrine of coverture, where a woman is labeled as a femme covert. And the first woman we encounter is Sarah Ann Davis, age 29, who's married to John C. Bethia, who's 20 years older than her. This is a time period where grown men grooming younger women was a real thing, and it was okay to do so. When it comes to being a femme covert, a few things need to be pointed out. Number one, when Sarah got married, she gave up all autonomy, all rights. Anything that was based on her identity was gone and it merged into his. She had no legal independence. The slaves and wealth she inherited from her father and her aunt went directly to her husband, which means all of the wealth that he inherited from her, he had the right to do with it whatever he wanted to. So he had the right to own, sell, trade, discipline, profit off of, and dispose of however he wanted. She had no rights over her slaves. She could not perform any commercial endeavors without her husband's permission. As a matter of fact, Sarah's last free will decision was choosing to marry John. At this point, according to this doctrine, John controlled her body and her property. But in this chapter, we find out that is all a myth. It's just on paper and it don't mean nothing. Because Sarah and her ilk was out here saying, to hell with your laws, to hell with your doctrine, the slaves is mine, I'm going to do what I will, what I want, how I want, and it don't matter. See, we end up learning that the patriarchy is real and all that other stuff was in writing, but these white women during the enslavement times were really out here wilding. So when we talk about women who were enslavers or women during colonial periods not having certain rights, understand this. They were able to bypass a whole lot. Okay, let's get into Sarah and John. Sarah and John had their own slaves. Sarah, she had hers all well kept, well nourished, well slept, well taken care of. John beat the hell out of his slaves and was like, y'all property, not humans. So when you saw John and Sarah's slaves, you knew whose slaves belonged to who. Sarah had this motto of slaves will perform better by the way that you treat them. And it wasn't because she was all moral and, loving the Lord and whatnot. It was about presentation and an investment in her property. And she wanted a return on her investment. John just didn't care. So one day, John decided that he was going to beat one of Sarah's slaves. Sarah ran outside on the porch and was like, nah, John, don't touch my inwards. Not don't touch my property, not don't touch her, don't touch them, naming by them names. Just don't touch my inward. And John didn't. And this is why they say that the doctrine of coverture is a myth. Because based on the slave narratives, what Sarah did by telling John not to beat her slaves was very common among white women enslavers. And so in chapter 2, we start to dive a little bit more into the roles that looked one way on paper, but was totally different inside the courtroom and inside the house when it came to women owning slaves. Sidebar. Can't remember if I mentioned this in the first video, but I think it needs to be mentioned again. Throughout this chapter, they refer to slaves as property. Throughout this book, I have a feeling they're going to keep referring to slaves as property. When people talk about the Civil War was about property and not slaves, what do you think the property was? Just want to throw that out there. Let's make a little bit of connection here and use some critical thinking skills while we're here. But I digress. The book continues on speaking about how women enslavers would put out ads to capture runaway slaves and how slaves were returned to jails, and it was the woman who went to collect them, the enslaving woman. There were also instances of municipal officials who paid women enslavers for the service. Now, in order for white women enslavers to actually make a come up, they had different systems in place. And when I mean systems, it was some white women enslavers looking out for other white women enslavers against their husbands. And part of that was through anti-nuptials, aka the prenup. So let's learn a little bit about what these prenups included. It secured a way for women to have some control over their property. Now remember, the doctrine of coverture only took control of their body and their property. The anti-nuptial didn't give control over their bodies. So since they didn't have control over their property, their bodies, they wanted to make sure they could at least control one thing, their property. In these nuptials, they forbade husbands to control their own property. They mentioned that they must consult with the female beneficiaries before changing anything in their estate. They granted women profits produced from these properties that they owned. They had the power to control, dispose of, mortgage, buy more property as they saw fit. So this is basically a counter of the doctrine of coverture. Now, the reasons they did this was for obvious reasons. You know, they were going to lose everything as soon as they got married. But there were some other things going on, like real shady stuff. All of it's shady, but let's talk about it. So did y'all know that they had men out here perpetrating? They were out here saying that they was rich, owning plantations and whatnot. Meanwhile, they was overseers and didn't have no land of their own. They were employed by the master themselves. And this is how they were getting wealthy, white enslaving women and their inheritances. So these anti-nuptials were put in place to stop themselves from being duped by these men who were perpetrating. Because back then, these men had the opportunity to leave the South and go out west and come back and make it seem like they own so much. And it wasn't like we got social media, go ahead, run your track record. No, this was all word of mouth. Another way that they were protecting themselves is if they were a widow. These prenups protected all of the assets they gained from their previous husband. And also it protected them against men who had multiple families out here. They were going to keep their coins one way or the other. These same systems that were put in place to allow white women enslavers to gain wealth, because the more slaves you had, the more wealth you had, showed a different side of the inhumane actions of owning slaves. So Mary Jane Jones was considered a nest egg who was gifted as a breeder. A slave husband was brought for her to breed children and to make her masters rich, or her mistress. F.H. Brown was the property of another slave owner, and she had 26 children for the Brown family. Throughout the entire plantation before emancipation, the Browns owned 75 enslaved Africans and became a wealthy slave-owning family. In February 19th of 1844, An enslaved woman by the name of Winnie went to court over her freedom, because while it was important for the white women to know the law to protect themselves against their husbands, it was also important for enslaved Africans to know the law in secret to protect themselves. Winnie was about to be wrongfully enslaved, and her mistress put it in her contract that she wanted Winnie to be freed upon her death. Her stepson, who was over his father's property, knew this, but didn't change the language when it got time to go dish everything out. So Winnie took them to court, and he had no choice under oath, because, under oath, I guess they felt they were compelled to actually be honest. He admitted that he heard his stepmother talking about freeing Winnie. He was aware of the contract that was going to determine her freedom. And by having him as a witness, Winnie actually won her freedom. But don't get it twisted. It had nothing to do with his morality. He was going to make Winnie a slave despite her mistress's wishes. It just so happened that Winnie knew the law in secret. Knowing the law was important not only for the slave, but also for them trying to. The chapter concludes by discussing how white women enslavers would war with their relatives, especially like there would be wars between mothers and sons, fathers and daughters, uncles and nieces over property, over enslaved people, and how these women would use these contracts to make sure that they would constantly have control over their property. They had to fight the patriarchy, but they were also winning. I really hated the concept of this chapter because of the way that white women enslavers viewed enslaved black people. It was all about not seeing their humanity. Like, how could you not see this trade, this thing that you're fighting for, your autonomy of your own body, your autonomy of your own inheritance? You can see that as worth fighting for, but you cannot see the fact that your inheritance is a human being. You can't see that you're separating families. You can't see that you are harming generations while you are building wealth for future generations in your families off of the backs of enslaved black people. And it frustrates me reading this chapter because I'm like, in order to get through it, you have to see it as just property. But then when you finish reading the chapter, you realize they're talking about human beings. They're talking about wanting autonomy and ownership of human beings while wanting to exercise their rights. This is why there is such an issue when it comes to womanism and feminism in our country, because they're able to separate themselves from the humanity of black people. I am frustrated. What are y'all thoughts? Let me know. Let's talk about it, because this chapter was almost as bad as the first one, which was about brutality. This is just about not seeing how you are gaining wealth and generational wealth on the backs of human beings. Let me know your thoughts, because I'm done. I'm just done.